check the clocks. It is post daylight saving times, or is it daylight savings time?
We are in daylight saving time. We have saved daylight.
Wow.
It's going to get lighter later
The
today.
salvation of daylight. Praise Yah. Hallelujah.
boy.
Yeah, I talked about the word hallelujah in my sermon on Sunday. Check those clocks in daylight savings time. It is a time to think. Chris, we might have some new listeners to A Time to Think because in Wausau, I've made a push to be really annoying.
You've offered several $1,000s, haven't you?
Yes, I do. I tend to bribe people. I did bribe them that I would buy a book for them at $1.50 less than they could get it on their own.
Wow.
And it's here now. So if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't yet gotten a copy of Digital Liturgies, at least in Wausau, let me know. I've said before that I aim to be so annoying that it's helpful.
Yeah.
And that's kind of this.
I am to be so helpful, it's annoying.
Oh, man. You and me. We're like yin and yang.
We're both annoying and helpful.
Yeah, and yet people still come on Sundays.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. Must mean that the church is more than the pastor.
Or that we're terrible charity cases.
Yeah. I like pity sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, when it's from Mr. T or from Jesus.
Yeah, I pity the fool.
Yeah. Or, Jesus pities me and my sin and saves me.
That is correct.
That's pretty
Yes.
cool. So if you're new to the podcast, what you just heard is not abnormal. Usually a podcast starts off with a little rambling, maybe a story here or there to personalize the two Carls, Christopher Carl and Joshua Carl.
Or
and
one old millennial and one young millennial.
which one of us is the old one?
I'm the old one.
Yeah, but I'm bald. So
You are bald.
if we walked into a restaurant, we might make someone guess.
We'll even out.
Yeah.
See?
So on A Time to Think, eventually we get to a point where we are seeking to carefully and thoughtfully engage with issues regarding the culture and the church. We started this podcast a few years ago, Chris, because we were coming up on the summer, and we thought, man, last summer we did a series on race, gender, sexuality.
Christ to culture, which you can find on our website still.
Yes, you can. Christ to culture. And we thought, well, hey, people have seen things about race, gender, and sexuality every single day for the last year. Do we do another sermon series? And we were kind of in this place of how do we talk about things that are on people's minds all the time, but if we were to only talk about from the pulpit, it would really overshadow the exposition of the Bible. And so we came up with the idea that we would do a podcast called A Time to Think, where we could cover some of those topics, but also cover them in a way that we hope is a little slower, a little bit, not apathetic, but I've used the word dispassionate, and by that I mean we're not here to drum up excitement or to...
Yeah, we take tranquilizers before we come in here, right?
I drink coffee. So we're not looking to say something that really grabs your attention, or the types of things that are going to be on a headline or on a news headline or on a breaking news. That we're living in the world of someone trying to get your attention, even if it's not true. And we're trying to step back from that and say, hey, actually, it's really unhelpful half the time.
Yeah.
And so we saw a culture around us that was quick to share opinions, quick to share brief, overly simplistic opinions, and quick to be ignorant and unthinking. And so we started A Time to Think because Ecclesiastes says there's time for everything.
Yeah.
There's a time for weeping and rejoicing, a time for living and dying. There's a time for passionate action, but there also has to be a time to think.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at here on A Time to Think. And you've got Christopher Tillman, who's a pastor of a congregation in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. Josh Holland, I'm a pastor of a congregation in Wausau, Wisconsin. And pastor is another term for shepherd. Pastor is kind of close to pasture. You shepherd in the pasture, right? So
we live in pastures. Yeah.
You do?
Yeah, we do. Both of us
You have
do.
a big backyard.
That
You have any
is true.
sheep?
No, not yet. Not
Chickens?
yet. I'm cutting trees and stuff down right now.
You are?
Yeah. But
So you're
I'm just
cutting
letting
down
my children
trees.
loose back there. I'm not putting animals back there.
One of our other elders couldn't keep a tree alive. So that's another way to cut down trees.
Yeah. Well, I just like killing them off.
Oh,
It's
yeah, that's
really,
nice.
really big to me.
So shepherds go to the pasture and pasture the sheep, tend to the sheep. And so one of the jobs of a shepherd is to try to not only answer the questions that those under our care have, which we long to do as well. So if you have any questions, let us know. But also to anticipate dangers outside the pen or dangers inside the pen. And one of the things that I've thought about for close to a year, Chris, is just I love the word ubiquity here. So on The Time to Think, your new word today is ubiquity.
That's a planet, isn't it? Ubiquity, the planet?
Well, no, it's no longer a planet.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, it's like Pluto. It got deplanetized.
Bummer.
Poor Pluto. So ubiquity, you might say it means the everywhereness.
Yeah.
It's just everywhere. And the ubiquity that I'm talking about is the ubiquity of technological digital age. There's are you familiar, Chris, with the old speech from, I think, Kenyon College with David Foster Wallace?
Nope, missed out on that one.
You never saw this?
I don't
Okay,
think I
this
ever
is
did, no.
it's where he has this, he shares this joke, and I'll try to maybe not use the word that needs to be bleeped out. But he's an atheist. He's talking to college graduates about how to think, and he says something like one fish goes to another fish and says, "Oh, the water's pretty warm." And the other fish says, "What is water?" And the joke is longer than that. You can find David Foster Wallace's Kenyon College address, but his opening point is we are often unaware of what we're swimming in. And really, as you redid the website recently, as I've done some vision casting projects, one of the core pillars of Downtown Mission Church and our hearts as shepherds is to help, this isn't a dig, but help fish see the water we're swimming in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So we might just say, well, of course I have a smartphone in my pocket. Like, why wouldn't I? That's the water we swim in. And we want to step back and say, what's dangerous about that water? What should you be aware about that water?
Yeah, not necessarily get out of the water, but understand the water you're swimming in.
Exactly. So we're not, hey, run and hide, but let's understand the environment we're swimming in. And all of that introduction brings us to the point where we are looking at a book called Digital Liturgies, which I have found massively helpful.
It's by a man with two first names, Josh.
Which usually I won't trust.
We don't trust, right?
Yeah,
but
yeah,
we will trust him. Samuel James is the author. You want to tell us about Samuel James, your relationship with this book?
I have a digital relationship.
A digital relationship, yeah.
So first of all, I'll just encourage, if you haven't picked up a copy, whether that's grabbing one from me or getting one online, this topic, because technology is so ubiquitous, this is going to need to be something you think about for more than 45 minutes, five times, right? So the purpose of this podcast, it's a launch pad.
Yep.
And it's a launch pad. Go read the book. One of the benefits of reading a book rather than an article, reading a book rather than a podcast, is books tend to help us read, and then something catches our attention, we can close the book and think about it. That's one of the ways we get changed, is not just through absorption of content, but through meditation on what we read. And so I would encourage anyone to not only listen to this podcast, buy the book, and then have discussions with other people, workshop ideas, and really in that triad of actions, it's gonna sink in, and you're gonna think deeply. This book is one that I saw on the Twitters, which is digital.
X.
Yeah,
Josh,
it's Twitter. It's like when I was in college, we had Duck, which was the Downing University Center on campus.
Okay.
And people gave out little rubber duckies that said DUC on it. It was great. Everyone loved Duck. And then they revamped it, and they're like, the president said, we're not calling it Duck. That's demeaning. This is Downing Student Union. Well, you know what is less fun to say? DSU. So all the juniors and seniors were welcoming freshmen like, it's Duck.
I had the same thing,
Twitter.
actually. The same thing.
It's Twitter.
At UWSP, it was always the University Center, all right? That's the big kind of hub where, there are different events. When I was on staff with Crew and Campus Ministry, we had our weekly meetings in the University Center. And then they did a revamp of it. They updated it and put a whole bunch of new stuff in there. And now everybody calls it the DUC, the Dreyfus University Center, which is named after
Duck.
D. Sherman Dreyfus. Exactly. So everybody now calls it the DUC. And I'm like, you mean the UC? It was the UC. That's what it was. But it's Duck, so you can call it what you want now, Josh.
My miniature rubber ducky that says DUC on it, I can bestow to you.
Well,
Wow, it's like a rite of passage, but from the younger millennial to the older.
Yeah.
How beautiful.
Yeah. Well, you have a UWSP campus here in Wausau.
That's still very confusing.
It is very confusing to me as well. Yeah.
So I came across a lot of books. I have to read books for seminary. I follow writers. But I take note when a lot of different people are saying, you got to read this book.
Yeah.
If the publisher is saying you got to read this book, or the author is saying you got to read this book.
Makes some sense. Yeah.
Or the type of person that I think would like that book says you got to read this book, then it's like, okay, maybe one day. But when I see everyone saying you got to read this book, so I picked up the book at a conference, and I think I read it in a day because I started to think, oh my gosh, this is putting language, and it's not just dire, like everything is doomed and nothing can be fixed, but it's, hey, we're not living in the world the way we could be living in the world, and here's some types of things. And so I remember thinking at that point, I got to go through this with some people. Well, providentially meaning in God's wise plan, providentially, about 2 months later, I look at the syllabus for my pastoral ministry class.
And what should you find? What to your wondering eyes should appear?
8 miniature reindeer, or 12 miniature, whatever. What to my wondering eyes did appear?
Samuel James
digital
and his
liturgy
wonderful reindeer. Yeah.
And so then I had the privilege of going through it a second time, meditating on it personally and doing some writing on it. And now going through it a third time to do this podcast. And each time, I told this to the congregation in Wausau, you probably have never heard me say the sentence that I'm about to say, because I try to be really slow to recommend books.
Yep.
Every Christian should read this book, is what I told them. And so that's why we're going through it, because that's the core that I thought. I thought there's not a new Christian or an old Christian that's unaffected by the technological age. And therefore, there's not a new Christian or an old Christian who doesn't need to think about it.
Yeah.
And so that's really the heart behind this series of podcasts. And you have been gracious, Chris, to kind of
Put up.
see my youthful zeal and say, all right, I'll go along.
Yep.
So the heart of this podcast is trying to unearth things that maybe we take for granted in the water that we swim in, but that we need to.
You just did some mixed metaphors, Josh. Unearth in the water.
Yeah.
Let's think about this.
The Bible mixes
Let's
metaphors.
detect in the water. Let's detect in the water.
But the Bible mixes metaphors. I was just thinking this week that you have all this language of Jesus, like, come on the throne as I have conquered and I'm on the throne. And it's he's walking up to the throne, and it's the one who's on the throne and the Lamb. And so it's throne, 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 throne. And all of a sudden, Revelation 19, you're at a table.
Those are visions, Josh.
Just saying. Like, is the table on the throne? Is it by the throne? Somehow, the Lord is trying to show us that Jesus is both feasting and reigning.
Hey, there we go.
We need 2 metaphors for
Feast,
that, don't
reign. Yep. Well, we're going to unearth and swim. We're going to unearth and swim. That's the plan here as we go through digital liturgies. Unearth and swim the culture in which we dwell. We can dwell in both water and the dirt.
Man, Chris is very intentional with his language. If you've been at Stephen's Point, his thesis statements are packed with riches. You know, it's like, it's good. Yeah. So, Chris, I'm going to give you a statement I think is packed with riches, and I want you to reflect on it.
Good.
Because
let's get rich.
I don't believe you've read the book, right?
That's correct. I have not read the book.
So you are going to be kind of bouncing off.
We're working through this.
Yeah. So that's helpful because it's not just parroting what you've already read. You're going to be processing live. So Samuel James writes the book because he says in the introduction that we tend to view devices. When I say that, I'm primarily thinking smartphones because those are the ones that are always on us.
Sure.
Those are the ones that are kind of, you're at a coffee shop and they're in sight, and you might be thinking, like, usually your laptop is not in sight while you're at your friend's house, right? It's not in your pocket while you're at church. So the most ubiquitous tends to be the phone, and James,
followed by the Palm Pilot or pager. Please continue.
So James says we tend to view devices neutrally. And we tend to view content on devices as good or bad. So most of our Christian engagement with what we should watch, what we should view, tends to be what types of content should you definitely not watch.
Sure.
But not necessarily about the device or the environment. Here's what I mean by environment. Chris, you made a really helpful point the last time we talked about media, that Facebook presents a type of environment where you could see 2 different types of content. One of them is a puppy, and one of them is someone on vacation.
Yeah.
A third type of content would be political discourse. None of those 3 types of content is necessarily sinful, wrong, any of those things. But if you see them back to back to back, you are thrown all around like, oh, need a puppy. Oh, I wish I was on vacation. I hate this person.
Right.
And we're just not made to dwell in that kind of
Everybody seems to be doing so well emotionally these days, though, Josh. I don't know.
Yuck. So James says devices and even websites are not neutral. They are an environment. Here's what he says. The internet is an epistemological environment. Epistemological meaning nature of thought. The internet is an epistemological environment, a spiritual and intellectual habitat that creates particular ways of thinking and feeling. Thoughts on that? It's not just neutral, but a particular environment that creates ways of thinking and feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concept of create is important there, and I think it's important, especially in view of what we're seeing with the whole AI experience, right? And so, just recently, the other week, Google got blasted because there was some
Their AI images.
Well, the AI was putting stuff out that was clearly biased against white people. right? And so people got really upset about this, as they
Images
should have.
of founding fathers that are a different race than
Yeah,
Anglo.
they're putting stuff out there that's not accurate. It's not true. And so what we see with that is like, okay, well, AI is clearly just some type of software interface that is able to generate material free from bias. But what we're finding here is that AI is as biased as its creator, right? So there is ultimately, I mean, this is kind of like, you just think about the whole idea of evolution, and like, it's well, things just kind of came into being. Well, it's not true. It's not true. Things don't just come into being. Things are created, and they're created with characteristics. They're created with flavor. They're created with something that kind of gives an initial feel to what is this that we're looking at here. And so, if AI is showing us that the results that it's producing are a directly influenced course by the one who has said this is what it ought to be like, well, of course you should take a step back then and see that, in the fields of what we'll call science and technology that people often look at as a completely objective, bias-free platform. It's simply falsifiable, testable information, and you can just go to it and be confident that it's true. I think what we're finding, at least what we should be finding, is that the medium is itself designed. It's not just a blank medium. So we might say that there's a medium that is free from interference in as much as it doesn't communicate a particular perspective, like speech, right? Just to speak, it's just the ability to communicate an idea. Now, how your inflection, all that kind of stuff goes into it, but when it comes to digital media, we're not dealing with something that's a neutral platform. We're dealing with something that is created in order to be understood a particular way. Mm-hmm. The Amish, just give an extreme example, the Amish are not being influenced by digital media because they're not going to it. But if they went to digital media, they would be engaged in a particular way that's different if somebody's just speaking, Yoder to Yoder in the Amish community, because the digital platform is designed to do certain things. Just as a quick example, and we'll get into this, but you look at, I just mentioned this because free agency opened today for the NFL.
Yeah, we're super hypocritical, by the way. We just got really excited on Twitter about free agency.
I got real excited. Well, it's real life though.
Yeah.
Free agency is real life, and so there's a free agency tracker, and it was on the Athletic. The Athletic website has a paywall. Now, for me, whenever I go online and I look for sports news, I'm like, okay, stay away from the Athletic because it's going to be really good writing and it's going to cost you money to read it. Mm-hmm. And so I go to the Athletic, and if I see it pop up as a news story, I'm like, oh, not going to click on it because I'm just going to be disappointed, right? But then you go to something like Yahoo Sports, and you're like, well, yeah, this is going to be as much as I want, but it's going to be a lot of garbage with it.
Right.
So the medium does have some type of a flavor that gets added to this. And so when we're creating the environment for content to be distributed digitally, it very much does have something to do with what we're actually consuming itself.
Yeah, and the key here, just to repeat, is to step below the nature of what you're seeing. So it's not just that an Amish person, is not affected by the types of words or coverage on Fox versus CNN. It's that they're not affected by the same type of environment that both Fox and CNN possesses, which is the breaking, fast, now environment. And so another example of this, as we're trying to just uncover what we're really trying to drive down to, is it's been said that we live in an attention economy. Mm-hmm. So then you think, well, what is the design of Facebook, the design of Twitter, the design of Apple in my smartphone? Why is my entire phone a screen rather than half buttons anymore, right? The entire design of all these things is to keep my attention.
Right.
Such that, and we'll just pick on ourselves, we know we got together to do a podcast, and then we see free agency on Twitter. Guess what wants our attention?
Yeah.
And we could scroll, I can not only see Titans free agency, I can see Packers free agency, and Cowboys, and we can keep going, and we can keep going, and we can keep going. And all of the links and hyperlinks are designed to keep my attention.
Correct.
The same with the speed of TikTok videos. The same with just the ability to scroll up on Facebook.
Yeah.
And I was told in broadcasting school, you're not selling news to people. You're selling eyeballs to advertisers. You're telling an advertiser how much attention we've got.
Yeah.
So if you win ratings, you get to go to the advertiser.
And you won ratings, Josh.
Quite a bit.
You were entertaining.
Quite a bit. That was before I lost my hair, though. So,
And nothing with your hair, it was your sparkling personality.
So for real, when I was on the air with Justin Lowe and Rebecca Ribley, we won ratings.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what our advertising department was able to do? Say, we got more eyeballs from 5 to 7 a.m. than they do, so you pay more money. And the whole of the news environment is to keep attention. Now, I've shared this example before, but that's why the A block, the first block of news, that longest block that has the hard-hitting stuff, it always ends happy. Because, or like predicting a human interest story. Why? They want to keep your attention. They don't want you to end with crime in your city, and you're like, ugh, I should go elsewhere and watch Leave It to Beaver.
Right.
That'll make me happy. You always have to drive back to how to keep someone's attention, so that's why they're telling you what's next after the break. And why do they want to keep your attention? Because you need to have the attention during the advertisements, because that's what you sell.
Yeah.
So all of these things, television, news, Twitter, Facebook, iPhone, smartphones are designed to grab Chris's attention and keep it as much as possible. And the question we're asking with digital liturgies is that what we were designed for?
Right.
You mentioned AI, that everything is designed for a thing. Okay. So a car is designed to do a thing. A car is not designed to fly or swim.
Oh, but it should.
So if you tried to make a car fly or swim, it's going to be drastic and catastrophe, right?
Yes.
And so the same is true with human beings. We have to ask the question, as we have these devices and sites that are trying to make us do something, namely keep all of our attention and scatter our attention is another one.
Yeah.
Twitter is not designed for, maybe you have this, Chris, you're a reader, like you can handle really heavy, weighty, long form concepts.
Sure.
But you ever get on Twitter and you're like, oh, I'm interested in that article, and you click on it and you read a paragraph and a half, and you're like, I'm not really here to read.
I'm going somewhere else, yeah.
I didn't get on here to read.
Yep.
I got on here to flick.
Yep.
I got on here to like quick opinions.
Yep.
And the question we have to ask, Chris, is, am I designed for that? In the same way we have to ask with the Facebook, am I designed to feel 14 emotions rapid fire? Am I designed to always be on guard and argumentative? And that's where Samuel James comes with his first chapter on biblical wisdom. So that all is just like a setup for the introduction of why we would talk about this. Maybe one more thing I'll say from James's book as to why we would talk about this. He says we often don't fully comprehend our own world. Like the amount of technological innovation has led us to a place where yesterday morning the printer didn't work. I have no idea why it didn't work. It wasn't connected to the Wi-Fi. I didn't know how to connect it to the Wi-Fi. I don't understand what's in front of me. When my phone wasn't logging onto an app today, I don't know why. I just turned it off and turned it back on and hoped. Like there's so many things in my world that I don't know how they work. How does a text message gets, like, you think about like how it gets to some sort of tower and then over to your phone. I don't know how that works. I just know it happens. Yeah. And so one of James's points is that we don't actually understand our world. And the product of all of this kind of rapid pace, dealing with things we don't understand, he says, our eye strain headaches, that feeling where you've been on a little too long and you realize, like, I should have put my phone down 10 minutes ago, or I shouldn't be using the light in the dark. Yeah. Our eye strain headaches, our lethargic desire to binge watch, our sense of anxiety and loneliness all tell us something is different, but we don't have the ability to name it. And so the purpose of his book is
we're going to help them name it, Josh.
So the first thing he names is the idea that the world is created with wisdom. He draws a distinction that I want your reflections on, Chris. Yeah. The distinction is between cultural wisdom and biblical wisdom. He says, culturally, we tend to think that wisdom means having the correct answers and making the right decisions. So a wise person might be a successful person, right? Sure. That person has had the answers and made the right decisions. Yeah. Or getting wisdom is getting the right answer or knowing the correct decision. Yep. But biblical wisdom, he says, is living in harmony with reality. He bases this on Proverbs 3:19, which says, "The Lord by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens." And so therefore, holistic wisdom, he says, sees that reality, there is reality, reality has an author, and reality's author is majestic and sovereign and worthy of loyalty. Yep. That's where Proverbs gets the idea of the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Can you reflect on the distinction there between having the right answers versus living in light of reality? Yeah.
So, I mean, something I'm drawn to, Josh, when I think about this, when I was going through RTS, my master's, similar to what you're going through now, one of the things that I was kind of captured by in my, I think it would have been my history of philosophy and Christian thought, or it was an apologetics course or something like that. But I think it was with Dr. Frame, and what I was introduced to was this idea of that we want to think God's thoughts after Him, and that a lot of times we can think about that just in terms of theologically, that we want to isolate the idea of a theologically centered world to the area of theology, the discipline of theology, and so
thinking just like, who is God and what is
right,
salvation?
Exactly.
We want to think those thoughts, but then the rest of our life might not really be the thoughts.
Exactly. Yeah, and one of the huge contributions that out of the Reformation, the emphasis on seeing Scripture as central and so forth was the idea of seeing the whole world in a God-centered capacity, and so this division between the secular and the sacred, which had developed over hundreds of years going into the medieval period, where you have professional clerics who are alone allowed to read the Bible, who are alone allowed to function in many different ways. The Bible just says, hey, every believer should be doing these things, living a God-centered life. The general population, the peasants, if you will, were kept from those things. And so out of the Reformation comes this idea that all of life is to be God-centered, and that is for everybody, that every Christian person is called to this. And so there's
some really amazing quote from, I think, the Queen at the time of the Reformation about how that like the peasantry of Reformation worship.
Okay.
Because it wasn't ornate.
Sure,
It wasn't supposed to be lofty and above people. It was singable. Mm-hmm. And that's an example of, hey, this is not for an elite class. This is for the commoner. Exactly. And so much so that the elite class was like, ugh, the peasantry.
Yeah, looking down upon it. And so, as we kind of process this way of thinking, which is biblical, right? So if you're a Christian, you want to think biblically, then we have to see that the world that you live in is God-owned, and it's God-upheld, and it's God designed. I mean, it's not just designed by God, but it's designed for God, ultimately, God's purposes. And so if we want to think rightly, we want to think God's thoughts after Him, meaning if God is the one who designed the world, who owns the world, who knows the world, who upholds the world, then wouldn't we want to know it from His perspective? Wouldn't we want to know how to process reality? So, the other day I was at Target and I saw a new Tony Robbins book. Tony Robbins.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Banana Hands himself.
Easter Island.
He does have an imposing face, that's true. And he's even taller than I am. And so he released a new book about investing or something like that. Now, here's the thing. Tony Robbins is a charismatic individual. He captures your attention. He's got this uniquely deep voice. I mean, if I've got a deep voice, he's got this is Tony Robbins. It's
he's commanding.
Yeah, very commanding voice. And so Tony captures your attention, and you want to listen to him. And you want to listen to him because he portrays an image of success and can-doism. It's like, yeah, I can do that. I can do that too. But if you look at his own life, I mean, I believe he's been divorced. There are things in his life that aren't imitable. And so you think, well, why would I want to learn success from somebody who's had a failure in his most fundamental relationship, between people? Why would I want to do that? So there may be helpful principles there. I'm not going to deny that. It could be helpful principles, and that's fine. But if we want to invest our time wisely as Christian people in how we think about the world, how we process situations, and really what we view to be wise, then we need to go to the author of reality. We need to go to the upholder of reality, and we want to be wise because the Bible says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so if you want to be a wise person, it has to start with the fear of God, because if you don't start there, you're not going to be able to understand reality. One of the things from Dr. Frame, another thing I learned that was really, really helpful, that there's no such thing as bare facts or brute facts, okay? The world is always in context. The world that we live in is always in context. So if you go outside and you see a tree, it might be tempting to look at that tree and say, well, that's a tree, that's an oak tree, and to isolate that oak tree as just a matter of fact of nature, right? There's a tree. But, Dr. Frame and Reformation theology and the Bible would have us see there's a tree, but you go to the Psalms and you hear this anthropomorphic language being used, like, trees, clap your hands, rejoice in the Lord, that kind of a thing. Like, okay.
Now, the sun rises out of its chamber like a bridegroom, ready to run its course with joy.
Yeah, and so you hear this language and you think, okay, there's something about even the created order that God has designed for us to see that ends in him, that's designed for him. So we have to be willing to process reality, all of reality, not just what we call sacred aspects of reality, all of reality, through the lens of God made this world. And that's important. We need to think God's thoughts after him.
Yeah, and so I think it's going to be helpful, at least in this first podcast, to keep driving deeper that it's not just that types of content like the reading the wrong article or even watching something sinful is going to change you, but that even the amount of time you spend engaging in any content is going to change you. And that's ultimately where Samuel James is trying to get is, he's like he said, that lethargic headache or that eye strain headache. You're feeling like, I'm not supposed to feel like this.
Yeah.
Or that it's kind of like when you overeat regularly and you just feel kind of slow and bloated and you have this, I'm not supposed to feel like this. Like, that your body was created to intake certain types of things and to expend energy and to be in the sun. And so when you're in the winter and you've eaten way too much and the sun hasn't shone all that much and you haven't exercised all that much, you just feel, and then all of a sudden there's seasonal depression,
right?
Which is in part a symbol that my body hasn't gotten what it needs, right? And so it's not just the types of things my eyes see, but the amount of times I let my eyes see something that's going to let me know, hey, I'm out of accord with reality right now.
Where's another example? I mean, and this kind of will lead into future conversations, but, the idea of like, where do we find our relational engagement, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, one of the most terribly ironic things that we could find in the whole digital revolution that we are living in, that goes back to, good heavens, I mean, when I was 2006, something like that. You go back and you see the introduction of this new platform called Facebook, and what are the people called that you network with in Facebook? Friends, right? And your friends will like the things you do. Well, let's take a step back and think, all right, are we more friendly now or less than we were 15 years ago? Are we more relational now or less than 15 years ago? Do we have deeper relationships with these friends now or 15 years ago? And one of the reasons, I mean, just I guess right off the top here, one of the reasons I got off Facebook a handful of years back was all of these supposed friends, they're not by any fault of their own, but they're all vying for attention because this platform wants us to process our relational sense of our sense of relational fulfillment. We want to process through Facebook. They want to be the arbiter of how fulfilled we feel, and so they'll design their algorithms in order to get us feeling connected with other people. The problem is, did the Lord design us as human beings to find relational fulfillment in this capacity?
Yeah, so
that's what we're going to look at.
The question is reality knowing about someone? Or is knowing deeper? Because the Bible uses the word, this is very interesting, the Hebrew word to know has a really intimate component, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
It can mean to know intimately,
Is
fully.
it yada, is that the word?
It's yada, yeah. It's to know, or even to know sexually. The Bible's word...
We talked about this at men's group the other week, in fact. Yes, we did.
Wow, you guys go
so,
off
gentlemen,
the rails
at Stephen's point,
men's
you
group,
you know what knowing means.
So the point there is that the Bible, the Hebrew understanding that's going to be carried through the New Testament, so that when Paul prays that the Philippians grow in knowledge and all discernment and love, that knowledge is a deeper thing than bare facts, brute facts. And so, online engagement teaches us that, I can go to my wife and say, hey, a pastor I know, and he's I've never set eyes on him. I have only read his tweets.
Yeah.
But I'm prone to think a pastor I know. And all I know is some facts about him and what he said. Does that mean I know him in the way that I know you? I mean, you and I one of the best parts about working with you over the past 4 years is that we've gotten to know each other.
Right.
And that's caused friction at some points, but it's also caused deep relational joy. Because, dude, I know you. Right? And you know me. So when we're hashing out an issue in the church this morning, you know me, right? And so you're able to say, hey, I kind of see things like that you're doing, and it's because you know more than just what I've said.
Right.
Now, where that's important here is we have to ask the question, is reality that God has given to us just to know about a lot of people or to really know the people that are physically present with us.
Right.
And I think we can agree that reality is to know at least primarily the people that are in front of us, the people that are around us, the people whom God has sovereignly placed.
Now, Josh, is this going to be a diatribe against the use of digital media?
No, I think. Do you remember, Chris? We talked about non-confrontationalism, and we spent about 40 minutes saying, like, here's maybe how you could do better confrontation, and here's how you could say, hey, I think that's wrong. And then at one point at the end, we said, now we're not saying go and just punch people in the face. The reality is we knew who we were talking to.
Right.
We knew we were talking to largely people who are going to be more timid, largely people who are have imbued a cultural understanding of like, hey, don't really
Midwest
say
nice.
something's wrong.
Yeah.
And so we assumed one direction here.
Yep.
And I think that the same thing is true with digital engagement. We're kind of assuming that most of us, you and me included, have not properly reflected on the ways in which technology shapes us.
Sure.
And so we need to maybe we need to swing the pendulum just a little bit and spend a lot of time reflecting because we've spent the past 10 years being shaped by it.
Yeah.
So if you think, man, why 6 weeks? Why a book? Why? Because it's been, I mean, when was the smartphone, the advent of the smartphone?
2012 maybe.
Okay, so when I graduated, it was probably when I graduated high school that I first got one, which was 2012. I think it was available prior to then, but we're talking about 10 to 15 years of being shaped by a tool.
Yeah.
And we can take a few months to really reckon with how that tool has shaped us, right? Let's go to one more scripture passage. We mentioned Proverbs 3 that the Lord by wisdom found reality. In Psalm 104, you get this picture of the Lord bounding reality, setting limits.
Boundaries.
Boundaries. Yeah. Just a few notes. The Lord set the earth on its foundations, verse 5. The Lord covered the water, or covered the deep as with a garment. At the Lord's rebuke, the waters fled, the mountains rose and the valleys sank down. So all of this is saying God has ordered the mountains to be where they are and the valleys to be where they are. Verse 9, you set a boundary that they may not pass. Okay? You make springs. Why do springs gush forth in valleys? Because God makes springs gush forth in valleys. And then why do beasts have things to drink from? Because God has made streams rush through valleys. The whole of Psalm 104 is a blessing on the Lord for making a bounded universe. Why? Why do livestock have grass to eat? Because he causes the grass to grow for livestock to eat and plants for man to cultivate. So even here, you have this distinction of what livestock do with plants and what man does with plants.
Those trees, the oak trees, why do they exist, Josh?
Squirrels climb them. We cut them down to use them to build houses, right? And so one of the clear distinction between beast and man is beast only receives creation as is. I guess you could argue the beaver does a little bit. Man receives creation and then uses it to cultivate.
Yeah.
So the beast eats the grain. The man takes the grain and makes bread. And so what Psalm 104 is saying is God has actually set those boundaries. He has made it so that the cattle does not bake bread, but that man...
And then we put the cattle between the bread and call it a hamburger.
And God has ordained that as well. All of this is driving that the moon marks the season. The sun knows it's time for setting, verse 18. God made the darkness and its night, and that's when the beasts of the forest creep out. So the beasts know when to creep out. The young lions roar for their prey. But when the sun rises, verse 22, they go away and man goes out.
Yeah.
So even the daily cycle of sun and moon says, beast knows when to hunt, man knows when to work. Verse 24, O Lord, how many are your works? In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. And the idea is that the boundaries given by the Lord are good.
Yeah.
We praise the Lord for these boundaries. So that idea that not only has God set boundaries, but we also praise him for those boundaries, I think let's talk for the next 5 to 10 minutes just about two things. So we could talk about many things, but I want to talk about the idea of place and the idea of presence. Okay, place and presence. Place being Chris and Josh are in the room that Chris and Josh are in.
That is correct.
Presence being Chris and Josh are with Chris and Josh right now, and no one else. Now, that's the reality God has created. Because as Samuel James talks about in his book, God has made us as embodied creatures. And oftentimes, digital technology tries to disembody us.
Yeah.
Right? It tries to take us out of the body that we're in. Maybe you have intellectual limitations. You don't learn as well. You don't memorize as well. You can know anything, anytime. Maybe you don't have the resources to travel. You can be anywhere, anytime. So technology can disembody us, but to receive embodied creation, we have to receive things like place and presence. And I think that those are two places, Chris, pun intended, where I see the idea of the smartphone and digital media wrecking our reality most often, because we could be at a Super Bowl party and we could all be watching the same Super Bowl, sharing an experience in the
Taylor
same
Swift,
room.
yeah.
But if each of us is on our phone, we're all really in a different place. So we're in the same place, but not in the same place.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier that the reason I key in on smartphones here is because they're the types of things that are in our pockets or on the tables when we're with other people.
Yeah.
And just that little siren sound, if you will, calling to us from the smartphone can remove me from the presence of me being actually zoned in on Chris.
The presence of Chris
Yeah.
will be removed. Yeah.
So I mean, Chris, I got other things I can handle right now.
Yeah.
I don't
you
have
do.
to totally be with you. I don't have to totally be present. I don't have to give you my attention.
Oh, see you later.
And that was the time. So could you reflect on how God has given us realities of place and presence, and that oftentimes our tech usage, our digital engagement can disrupt those realities?
Yeah, I mean, this is something honestly that I talk about my own a good bit, and I don't have anything against the use of social media in as much as I don't think it's sinful to have it. I don't think it is, but something I just beg for in my home when it comes to how we function as a family is I just talk about being present with my family, with my wife and my kids. I just want you to be present. So if we'll sit down even to, and I think here's where we'll see kind of a difference even from a generation ago to the present, pun intended. When I was a kid growing up, we would watch shows as a family, right? So we'd sit down, and one of my favorite things that I would do would be, we'd watch Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. You remember that?
Yeah.
All right, so we'd watch Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego.
They ever find
and
her?
They did, but
Oh,
then
wow.
she escaped them
Bummer.
again and again and kept stealing different world monuments.
Wow.
So we would watch that on PBS, and my parents would make little pizza pockets, and we'd sit down and watch this on Fridays or something like that. And that was fun for me, and it was fun for me in part not just because I could sit down and watch Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, I watched it with my family. Right? I watched it with my parents, I watched it with my little sisters. So we'd sit and we'd watch that. And we would do, we'd have, Sunday night movies we'd watch as a family. That's what we would do. And so in my mind, I recall movies I watched as a child within the context of relationship, right? So it's not just I saw that movie. I can recall with whom I saw it.
Yeah.
I watched a movie with my dad. First movie I ever saw in a theater was Batman. It was the Michael Keaton Batman, like 89 or something like that. And I watched it with my dad. Right? So that's the memory. We have a much different situation now because people can pull up their phone and they can experience things in a completely decontextualized way in terms of having other people present with them or in a particular place. So, when I talk with my family about being present, it's like, hey.
That no longer is the theater the place you go to.
Correct.
Like my home is not the place where I watch the movie. The theater is the place. Or,
Right.
Blockbuster is the place where I go to get the movie.
Right.
And I can only do it every so often. We're removed from place. Because any place
Yes.
with my phone is now a place I can watch a movie.
Yeah, any place. And so, I think, okay, well, when I'm talking to my family, and, lately we've been watching this from it was 80s into the 90s, Sherlock Holmes. I grew up watching this. Right? Loved watching it with my family. It was great fun. And so, I've just told my family, if we sit down and watch it, I'd like to watch it together. We want to experience this together as a family so we can all enjoy and appreciate him. It's just a masterful job of depicting Sherlock Holmes by Jeremy Brett, the actor. It's just fantastic. And I want my kids to know it.
Yeah.
They're not, they might someday, but, age 7, they're not going to sit down and read Arthur Conan Doyle. They're going to watch this oh, that's the story from Sherlock Holmes. So we're going to do that together. And so there's going to be a context that they're going to experience this in, and we're going to experience that together. Now, when we think about how smartphones operate, right? You can access almost anything, anywhere now, and the only place you can't is the places that we will say, I'm never going to move to XYZ location because there's no reception.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So I can tell you, and Regan Ann, poor show, you might be listening right now. When I go out to your place, Regan and Ann, you who live off of County Highway X, I know every time I go there, my reception is going to be spotty. Now, I don't go out there to watch things on my phone, but I do know that my reception is going to be spotty.
Yeah.
And so we track our experience of geography
Yeah.
through like, okay, well, where's the dead zone? You know, we know this as we travel. Like, where's the dead zone? Where does my call cut out? Where does this happen? We know these things. We process. Now, again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with knowing those things. That's just the way it is.
But the reality, what we're trying to grasp in the water that we swim in is that there's a difference between sharing an experience together where the family has made a decision about what we're going to share versus sharing an experience, like not sharing at all. And
Right.
I think I've used this example before that both my wife and I are in seminary. We both love talking theology. But quite honestly, when she tells me about her seminary classes or I tell her about mine, it is not any different than me telling her about a video game I play.
Sure.
It's still
Yep.
kind of like this, okay, I'm a spouse listening to what my spouse is day.
Yeah.
And it's funny because we both deeply care about theology, but when someone else has had an experience and they're passionate about it, and in the course of a daily life, even if I kind of like the same type of category, I'm still like, okay, yeah, I'll listen to you because I love you. But there was one time where we listened to one of her lectures together, and we talked about it for like an hour.
Sure.
I didn't feel any compulsion to listen. It was like, oh, we shared this together. And there's a world of difference between kind of always living the almost these like siloed lives with all these different things we like to experience and we like to read, and then kind of almost colliding with the people around us and not knowing what they've experienced.
Yeah.
And what, you know, the difference between, I don't know, we could keep going there, but I'd ask anyone to just take 5 or 10 minutes and reflect on how your phone or your digital media engagement has robbed you of personhood, a person or presence or place, right? You know, for me, it's something as simple as my phone screams, "You could be elsewhere doing other things," and so that means.
Is that your ringtone?
Huh? Yeah.
You could be elsewhere doing other things, Josh?
My watch has buzzed, I think, 3 times in the past 15 minutes. And each time I have had to say, that's not more important than Chris.
Yeah. Thank you.
But what is, like, even I wear a watch that can scream to me, you should be elsewhere thinking about something else.
Sure.
That changes me.
Yeah.
I think all of us have had the experience of being in the room with another person, and they just say, just one thing.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, they're gone. Yeah. I mean, they're in the same chair, but they're gone.
Perhaps you've been that person. I've been that person. Yeah.
And when you do it, you justify it. You're like, it's just one thing.
Yeah.
And even if it is just one thing, what you've done is you've removed yourself from the personhood or the place, and that's jarring. And that's why, you know, if you're married or you have friends, like maybe you're judging them when they do it, but when they judge you, you get
Right.
angry because like, why are you judging me? And we're just in this environment where back in high school, I used to try to hide my phone if I was using it in class, but now I don't even hide it. I just pull it out.
Well, I mean, it's funny, Josh. I'm just thinking about, you know, experience with this and just, you know, history as technology has developed and everything. And I'm thinking even just video games, man, where, you know, I think about my time as a kid in the early mid-90s, and I'm like, don't bother me, Mom and Dad. I'm playing a video game, right? So I would sit there and I'd sit in front of the TV and be playing a video game. Now, it'd be cool if I had a 2-player video game because somebody else could play with me.
Yeah.
But hey, I don't care about that as long as I can sit down and play it. So it's me and this television screen. Now I've got my sisters around me. I've got my parents and all that kind of stuff. But man, I just think about how self-centered that time was for me, where it's, oh, you just got to play a video game. I'm going to play a video game, play a video game over and over and over again. And we're at a spot now where it's just become accepted that, you know, well, I got to do this. And we don't even ask questions about the nature of the content. I mean, everybody knows when I'm playing like Super Mario 3, there's nothing productive happening. I'm just playing a video game.
Yeah.
But now we don't ask that question. If somebody is sitting there and they say one more thing, it's like, what is that one more thing?
Yeah.
Well, you know what? It's been for me before. Look at my fantasy team.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, I'm going to look at my fantasy. Is that productive? No, it's not productive, but it's important to me. And so I'm going to check out into my own world and remove myself.
And you're not a guy that is anti-fun.
Correct.
If anything,
I'm so pro fun, it is ridiculous.
I'm probably more strict on the entertainment piece than you are.
You are,
And so
yes.
one thing to jump off here, and I think this has been a helpful tool, is you just said it's not productive, or I'm just checking out to play a video game. And generally, when I've had these conversations with Christians, the response I get to that is, it's not wrong.
Right.
And then I say something like, well, you're right, it's not wrong. And it's like, it's not sinful to play Super Mario Bros. And it's like, well, now we're talking about the sinfulness of the content.
Right.
Well, Paul Paul, when talking about something actually sinful,
What did he say, Josh? Preach.
In 1 Corinthians 6, he says, quote, all things are lawful, quoting the Corinthians, but not all things are helpful.
Yeah.
All things are lawful, quoting the Corinthians, but I will not be dominated by anything.
Yep.
And he repeats that 4 chapters later. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. And so the Christian is tasked with not only making individual choices like, is it lawful for me to check my fantasy football team? Is it lawful for me to play a video game? But the Christian has to wrestle with the question is, have I been made by God to go to another room and do my own thing most nights of the week? That's a proportionality conversation.
Yeah.
Is it helpful to my kids? Is it helpful to my community? Is it helpful to my neighbors?
Helpful in my church family. Yeah.
Is it helpful to my church family if the dominant theme of my life is pleasure? Those are the types of questions Christians have to ask. And so we have to be cautious not to just say, it's not wrong to eat ice cream. I use this as an analogy. It's not wrong to eat ice cream, but it's not helpful to eat ice cream 5 times a day.
Correct.
After each meal and for snacks. And so when we're talking about this idea of living in accord with reality, you say, is the predominant theme of my life seeking the types of things that interest me and only me at the expense of time, fostering relationships, serving others, growing spiritually, those types of things? And if so, we need to reckon with, my device actually has a much greater pull on me than I thought. So to wrap up this first conversation, there's so much more in the book, so get Samuel James. I don't know Samuel James. I don't make any money off of recommending his book, but it's a great book. He says that the wise life is lived in light of reality. The reality is that we have a material world and bodies given to us, and thus true wisdom requires us to accept and to live within a physical reality, and that entertainment usually disembodies that. And so, Chris, we gotta accept that on this Monday, God has made you and me to be in Wausau, Wisconsin together.
Yeah, we are. And you are wherever you are, and this has been a time to think.
This has been a time to think. If you can find someone to discuss these things with in person, ideally, over the phone would be okay. The idea that you can use this to foster relationships together.
Why don't you just get together and have a nice meal?
That's also allowed. That's the difference between Chris and Josh. We add productivity and relationality here on the podcast. This has been a time to think. Thank you for taking some time to think with us.